Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Valero community meeting for February 9th, 2021. Hope you're all having a good week. I'm posting the community notes in the Zoom chat if you're not already there. So we're going to kick off with status updates on items that we're working towards the roadmap priorities. So to start off, I'm helping get some credential support that Bridget's leading up on the volume snapshot locations. This allows for adding a credential secret credential to a volume snapshot location directly instead of relying on Valero's environment variable support. So this is just one component of the larger push. In terms of some process things, which we can go into later, I opened a couple PRs for GitHub automation. First one will be closing issues if we've asked for information and we haven't gotten a response for 35 straight days. And the other one is adding issues and labels to PRs and adding a PR template. So now when you open a PR, you'll get a template and it'll ask you for things like signing the DCO, creating a changelog, and uploading documentation. So looks like these are both merged. Thank you, folks. And then the next few parts, I've been working with Dave to solidify the roadmap for the next few versions. Hoping to publish that by the end of February, if not next week. But for now, for V1.6, we're aiming to get a pre-release out by the end of February. I don't know if we'll call it alpha, beta, or C, but looking to get feature complete, and the items that the team is really focusing on are these ones labeled as release blockers. We may get some other ones in between now and then, but these are going to be the focus. And anything around multiple credentials may pop into this list. So I just wanted to communicate that. So yeah, we're aiming for late February for a pre-release. And then for 1.7, we've been talking about this Velero debug command. And I started playing with CrashD or Crash Diagnostics, which is a VMware Tanzu tool that can gather a bunch of information out of your cluster. So I started playing with that and defining some Valero scripts. But that's for later work and won't be as part of 1.6. So I think that's it for me. Any questions?
I have a question. I wonder if we can put the timeout for Velero plugin into last release, or I have to wait for the next one. It's currently in review.
That's going to be the next release.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, and I'm moving on to Bridget.
Hi, everyone. So as Noel mentioned, we've been working on support for multiple credentials. I've just noted there are the two PRs related to modifying the CLI and then also getting the credential field into the VSL and BSLs, which I've been working off locally. So I think like if we can try and focus and just get bump those PRs just like a little bit up the priority queue, that would be super helpful for me, because then it unblocks me to push a new PR, which adds support into these for the BSLs and VSLs. So that means that they will be able to read that credential and then apply it whenever performing the operations with the plugins. I'm still working on the RESTX support. That one's the way the the way you pass credentials into RESTIC is just a little bit different. So that's just taking a little bit more effort just to make sure that I've got all the cases covered there. I haven't mentioned it here, but after this, yeah, I'll try and get some of the other high priority PRs reviewed. I've been doing a few of those, but I know there's still a few that I need to get back to where I've left comments, need to follow up. So I'll try and prioritize that once getting the other PRs in. That's it for me.
Great. Any questions for Bridget? Okay, move on to Carlicia.
Hello. So the download request PR, which is the migration to runtime controller, you had some files that needed rebasing. I did that. And so it's ready again for review. I addressed all the comments, obviously. And I'm wrapping up the addressing code reviews for the addition of a credentials field to the create backup storage location so we can support the multi-credentials that Bridget is working on. And after that, I'm going to prioritize reviewing any PR that's related to multiple credentials. And after that, I'm going to do the E2E test PR review.
Cool. Any questions for Carlicia? All right, we'll move on to Dave.
Okay, and yeah, thank you for reviewing on the E2E stuff. That'll be very helpful. Yeah, so I was on community support last week. No big blowups there, I don't think. If anybody has a problem, they can. I think we got everything moving at least. I've been working on the upload progress design doc. So this would allow us to monitor data that's moving after we've taken snapshots and after the backup is finished. So this is currently something that, like for example, in AWS, EBS snapshots, after you snapshot them, there's actually a phase where they're not ready to use yet. Same's true for like the vSphere plugin. So we're going to formalize this, bring it into Valero, where the backup won't actually say it's done until it's actually done. So the design doc's there, and moving forward, we're going to start doing architecture reviews on design things as a meeting. So I'm just going to go ahead and schedule a meeting for that, and I'll publish it here, and everybody's welcome to drop in and discuss. And for this week, I'm working on getting end-to-end tests running automatically. This is inside some of the VMware framework, because we've got a bunch of automation going on there. Once we get that going, I think we can look at maybe as a community thing, taking what we've got and hooking it together with like CAPI. So like we have tools to spin up clusters across multiple clouds, and setting that up so people can use it, and making it more public. Yeah, so that's it for me.
Cool. And the upload progress work, that's going to be aimed at 1.7, just to set expectations. And I know there's some issues around GCP uploading as well that this should address. So this is to make it so that Valero can wait for volume snapshots to be completed for sure before we mark them as ready to restore from Valero's perspective.
Mm-hmm. But also we'll be able to continue on with another backup. So we're not just going to stall the backup until everything finishes.
Right. Yep. Okay. Any questions for Dave? Okay, cool. Let's move on to the discussion topics. I saw Dave and Sean brought up this GitHub issue.
Yeah, Sean, you wanna take it? That's I had some questions on how we should do this.
Yeah, I think I had the same set of questions. Right, so I think we had a plan, and then we decided, like, well, you know, we're changing the defaults. This is going to be a breaking change. What do we actually want the behavior to be, so that we can make sure that we keep the, you know, user experience that people would expect, right? And so I think, like, that's where I think it was at. So just to give a quick background on the issue, effectively the issue is, can we use the Kubernetes context, kubeconfig context, and like the default one for Valero commands, so that you don't have to specify the namespace if you're in a different namespace than Valero every time, or set an environment variable, right? Instead, you work on your kube context. That's the issue. Obviously, this is a breaking change in the sense that right now the Valero namespace is the default. We would be changing that to the context default, and that would be that could potentially be a pretty large breaking change for users if they're not ready for it. So I think we were kind of talking about, okay, what is the right precedence order? And so Carlisi, I think, actually added a set of them right there. Yeah. So that's what we were going with. And then I think, Dave, you brought up some concerns around two specific calls around or two specific situations where it was the Valero install might then, is that going to go to the default namespace or the Valero namespace? Maybe is the Valero install, maybe that should be handled differently, was my, I think, response. Well,
so
yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to take a step back and, like, what's the feature, who's the feature for? Because the way I read this is something that's more of a feature for a Valero developer. Because I think most people are going to install Valero, and then they'll interact with it through the Valero CLI, but their context for their namespace is going to be whatever they're actually working with in Kubernetes, and it won't be the Valero namespace. Is that?
Now that I think about it, I think you're right, Dave. Because you install Valero on its own specific namespace, whatever it is, and then you don't want to. Why would you have a B in the namespace?
Well,
yeah, as a dev you are.
If you're a dev, definitely, but I guess if you're not a dev.
So let me step back, Sean. You're saying you had stated you'd like to Valero backup and Valero restore commands to understand your context. Can you expand on that? When you're using Valero backup and Valero restore, what are you expecting them to do?
Yeah, I mean, right, like Valero does watch the entire cluster, correct me if I'm wrong. So I can create backups in any namespace, and it will take backups of things in that namespace.
Nope,
right?
That's actually not how it works. All the backup CRDs go into the Valero namespace. So Valero does not watch every single namespace for the CRs. It stores all of its stuff in its own namespace. And that's because if you delete, let's say you're protecting namespace 1. If you delete namespace 1 with the backup in it, we then don't have the backup, or we'll have to do double entry.
Yeah. Well, the other thing with that is that if you have two different Valero installs in two different namespaces, each Valero only watches the one in that namespace, which allows you to actually have different versions of Valero installed. But I guess part of the issue here, I think, is, at least in our use case at Red Hat, with our migrations, is that we have Valero installed in an OpenShift migration namespace, for example, not Valero. And that, I think, is part of what's going on here. But at the same time, as a developer, if I'm migrating something, I'm going to be in that migration namespace, probably not that OpenShift migration namespace. So even in that context, at least for my normal workflow, the current namespace is not necessarily the one where I want Valero in. But at the same time, it's a non-default namespace, which I guess is the real issue here. Is what's the best way of telling Valero, or communicating to Valero what namespace to look at with the
Yeah.
Valero CLI.
So I can see two different features here. For example, like as a user, I might want to be able to say Valero backup minus current namespace, you know, or set that as my default so that when I do a backup, it just does the current namespace. As a user, that seems valuable to me because I don't have to mess with minus include and type in all this junk every time, or aliasing, and then it's wrong because I switched namespaces. So I think there's a feature there. And then there's a feature where we say, okay, if you have an alternate namespace or alternate namespaces, multiple installs of Valero, how do we make that easier to use? So I think we got two things going on here.
I don't know how people use it, obviously. I just don't know how I use it. Even like in non-developer mode, if I am using Valero and testing it out, the first thing I do is I want to switch into the namespace that I'm going to operate. And then whatever that is, I want Valero, I would like Valero to just know what that is.
Is that the namespace where Valero's installed or the namespace you're backing up?
Well, it would be where Velero is installed because for me to perform the operations, I need to
talk to the right Valero,
right? Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's where this came from in my mind.
And I think it's good. I think that having this ability to set that default, and I don't know what the right way is though, because it seems like the kubectl context is relevant to like us as developers because we're messing with the Valero internals and the CRDs. But if we make this the setup for the average user, 99% of the time, they're going to say Valero backup, and it's going to fail because it's going to whichever context, you know, they're working in, which doesn't have Valero installed.
I want to break this apart just a little bit. Valero's client, on the client side, you can tell Valero which namespace to send its resources to. So if you run this Valero client config set namespace command, it will say, when I say Valero backup, it'll send resources to that namespace. So in Scott's case, where they're using OpenShift migrate, you would set this to set namespace to OpenShift migrate, and that's where your Valero client would be operating. I think I'm struggling to figure out why a kube config, unless you're working on Valero, why you would use the kube config context unless you're saying back up my current context.
So as a developer, what I'm kind of hearing is I have multiple installs of Valero in different namespaces, and I'm going to work with them with kubectl, and I would like for my Valero commands to go to the Valero I'm working with and not to the wrong one. Okay.
Right.
How about if we had like an environment variable that says use my kubectl context as my Valero namespace. So then it switches with you as you change your context with kubectl, you'll go to the right one. And that's really a developer feature. I think it's useful for us all. And it's pretty easy to set an environment variable. You don't have to change it every time. You just set it once and say, this is the behavior I want. And then we go with this current proposal, but gated by that behavior. Does that make sense?
I'm still not following. Maybe I have a different workflow. I'm just not connecting.
Well, what I'm hearing is that people have multiple installs of Valero. And they want to be able to go to the right install, which is the one that they're actually working on using kubectl as well. And so they would have set the namespace in their context to the Valero namespace they're working on, you know, the Valero install they're working on. And they would like to just have the Valero CLI follow that.
Without this extra step.
Right. And so I'm thinking maybe we just have an environment variable that's basically for this scenario that says, I will follow your default context. And then all the rest of the stuff, it's just gated by that. If that's on, then this behavior happens. But for the average user, I don't think they want to have multiple Valeros installed. In fact, we don't want them to install multiple Valeros if we can avoid it. And they're almost certainly not going to be using kubectl with Valero. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Go to namespace. Like you might have a special string there that says, instead of, you know, called current, in other words, instead of telling it Valero or OpenShift migration, you know, there's a string you give it that says current namespace or something, and if it finds that string, it looks at the kubectl current namespace rather than that. And then it would follow your, you know, kubectl namespace, whatever, and it would follow that.
Yeah, that makes sense too. I mean, we can have a flag that's just like minus minus Valero namespace, equals current or something, kubectl. And then you can script that and not have to worry about setting environment variables and have everything be set somewhere else. Is that reasonable?
So it sounds like you're saying we would just say Valero client config follow namespace or whatever. So it's
or
still
have a command line option.
Well, I don't want to introduce a new command. Like if we introduce a command line option for every command.
It's not a command though. It's just, so right now we can say Valero minus minus namespace, right? And
Yeah,
that tells us what Valero namespace to use.
That's only one time.
Is it?
Yes. So that's what this does, is it makes it not one time. So if you, no, Valero, so if you do -- namespace on Valero backup or Valero restore, that will be for that single command. It does not change. It does not.
Or even on Valero get, or any of the Valero CLI options, really. If you're saying Valero, get backups -- namespace.
Right. It's only for that command. If you want to set it for all your commands, then you have to set it in this client config.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to introduce a brand new command. I would rather put the flag in the same configuration or use a Valero config for that.
Yeah, I would be leaning towards having something in the config that is just use context, which is a Boolean flag. Because I think as well, maybe I view the setting the config as more of an advanced use case, where it's something that you want to override. It's kind of, you know what you're doing. You want to set this for all of your all the times that you're interacting with Valero. Whereas we mentioned earlier about the 99% use case, most people are happy installing Valero and having everything be in that namespace. So I think maybe introducing another flag for all the commands, whether it's use context or follow context or something, just might just introduce a bit more complexity. That's my view on it anyway.
Okay, so I apologize because I had to reread the tickets just now, and I am confused. So apologies for my confusion, but I'm trying to guess what I was thinking when I opened this ticket, and it's been a while. So what I think that I wanted, and that I thought people also would benefit from, is have a way to configure so that when I specify where Velero is, what the namespace for Velero is. So if I issue a command for Velero, I don't have to specify that namespace, wherever I am. So if I say, if I have one, or if I have two, Velero installed in one namespace or two or multiple or whatever, that doesn't matter. So the namespace that I'm going to work with right now, I have a way to specify that, and I don't have to switch to that namespace, and I don't have to specify it every time. I think that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, and that's this command.
Yeah.
I do want to pop up and clarify that Valero only stores its stuff, its backup CRDs, its restore CRDs, all that in whatever namespace you give for Valero. But it doesn't scatter it across the cluster. It doesn't say I put backups in the default namespace unless you install it there. But it can query everything on the cluster. So that's how the Valero backup and restore process works, is that Valero itself lives in its own namespace. It doesn't write anywhere else unless you're doing a restore. So I just wanted to clear that up, and I'm open to suggestions on where we can put that information so it's more obvious. And specifically, Sean, does that help?
I think what the option that we're kind of talking about doing, where we would be able to set the config or tell the config to follow my cube context, maybe makes a little bit more sense. I think that that would work for the use case that I'm thinking of. Yeah.
So are you trying to just store your Valero backups in other namespaces besides Valero?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
like having multiple Valero installs, right? That are watching different namespaces throughout the cluster.
Okay. And so this setting it here doesn't.
So then you would have what you would have is a plugin that doesn't back up the Valero stuff, right? Obviously, rips it out of the backup, but that then I would be watching, each individual namespace, and so Valero backup in namespace A would back up namespace A.
Right. I guess
namespace B would back up namespace B, and the Valero instances would be segmented out. And users would be creating the backup CRs not in the Valero namespace, but in their own namespaces.
Yeah.
They only have access to create them there.
Yeah,
right? Through RBAC.
Yeah, that part we don't have right now.
No, well, I mean, you can kind of do it, right? You can set up Valero. You can set up multiple installs and then set up your RBAC the way that you want to.
Right. I see what you're saying. So basically, users would have two namespaces: the namespace they want to back up and the Valero namespace for them. But
yeah, I was kind of thinking it would probably be the same namespace. You would just have it would be the same namespace and then add a plugin that would remove the backup, right? Like remove the CR, the CRs that we want to get rid of for the Valero thing, so that when you do the backup, you just remove them.
Well, I guess the core of the issue is the Valero server only looks for CRs in the namespace it's installed in. So you would install Valero into that user's namespace as well.
You can't set a namespace for the Valero install. So Valero could be installed in namespace A and be watching namespace B.
No,
not right now.
So multi-tenancy.
Well, then I must have hacked the server. Sorry.
If it does, that was not intended.
I'm pretty sure I did that.
Okay. Well, if you did that, then I would like to see your configuration, just so we can, because I think that's the part I was getting hung up on here. But in that scenario, this makes more sense to me. So if you have like the commands you issued to make sure it watched a different namespace, then maybe my understanding's incorrect, and we do provide that split.
So we've been looking at multi-tenancy, and Noel and I were batting around different ways to do multi-tenancy, and I was suggesting that we do that approach where we let people write backup CRs into their own namespace. And Nolan brought the issue that as he stated earlier, that then puts the backup inventory into the namespace you're protecting. And we've got enough of a problem already with the backup inventory living in the cluster that we're protecting. But even putting it into this, but if you make it even more so where it's tied to the namespace, when you delete the namespace, the backup CRs disappear, and there's no good way to get back to them. So there's a multi-tenancy issue that we've got to address. We're not going to address it today. It's on the roadmap, and I definitely invite input for how we're going to get there. But let's not drive too much into the rat hole at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. We don't need to deep dive into that. But I do think that there's probably some ways that we could solve that problem.
There's definitely a solution that needs to come up, because right now we don't have a good multi-tenancy solution. Everybody who gets control of Valero can do basically anything they like to the cluster.
Yeah. So where we're at with this issue, Sean, if you got Valero, the Valero server to recognize for the Valero pod to be in one namespace but watch backups in another, could you post that configuration in this issue? Because that, at least for me, that helps me understand the environment this request is running in.
I think that's a bug if it does work.
Well, but it might be a bug we can embrace. I'm curious about it. If you're relying on it, I kind of don't want to break you.
I'm not relying on it.
Okay.
I do think that like that's probably a standard way to deploy some stuff, right?
Yeah,
I do think, I think lots of controllers watch namespaces that they're not like the right, and only watch one namespace. So I think like that's a pretty well defined pattern. I think that would be something that would make sense.
Sure. The problem is the declarative API part of it, where the backup CR is the backup, and for most of the other controllers, that's ephemeral with your cluster. If you delete your namespace, your resource is supposed to go away. If you delete the namespace that has your backups in it, the backups are not supposed to go away. So that's kind of the mishmash between the declarative and imperative APIs.
Yeah, they'll stay on your bucket, but we don't have a pointer to them anymore.
Yeah, so you have to reinstall, and there's a bunch of weirdness that has to happen.
Yeah.
Well, I know we just said we weren't going to drive down this rabbit hole, but wouldn't then you want to create finalizers on those backup CRs so that they can't be deleted until they're cleared?
No, you don't want to delete them. You want to be able to like get rid of your namespace and restore it in another cluster.
Right, but if you're watching namespace X and you've backed up namespace A, B, and C, and you accidentally delete namespace X, then you wouldn't actually delete namespace X because all those finalizers would stick around, right, until you clear them.
But
that would
sometimes
say,
sometimes you want to delete that, and
you want to delete namespace X.
Yeah.
You want to delete namespace X, which contains only your backups.
Your backup inventory isn't to your cluster. Your backup inventory is kind of floating across everything.
The inventory lives in the bucket, and what Valero will do on a new install is it will sync the bucket into that namespace X. So say you delete namespace X and then reinstall back into namespace X, like you delete it and recreate it. Valero server has at startup and while it's running has a sync process that it goes to the bucket you've defined and says, okay, are there backups in the bucket that I don't have listed in the cluster? And it'll pull them down. So that's how we get around the finalizer issue, because our source of truth for a backup is not the Valero namespace, because the backups can span clusters. So like when you do a restore, we don't reach into the original cluster and pull backups out of that namespace. We just pull them from the object store. Does that make sense?
Maybe I'll have to think about it.
Okay.
Let me. I'm gonna try to go find the config, and then we can. I think that this is probably all within that context of the non-admin or tenanted solution, right?
Something I owe.
Anyway,
I think we can move on for now, but something I owe is architecture docs that are public, so we can like refer to those. And that might make these conversations easier. But I think for now, does this config hit the does this client config hit the use case for now?
Yeah, I mean, yes, that will be completely sufficient for one big install across the entire cluster.
Yes.
Doing the thing.
Okay. Yeah, and then we can talk more about multi-tenancy.
I mean, I guess the question is, do you want to leave this issue open and put it underneath the tenanted solution issue as like a sub issue of the tenant problem, or do we think that this is, or is this, should we close this issue, say closed with the whatever, and then go and comment that like we close this issue, but it's part of the multi-tenant thing. Which one do you guys usually do?
I can refer this one to the multi-tenancy because I think this is a specific case of that. So I'll link it to the epic we have. I don't have that offhand, but I will link this.
Awesome, thanks. And sorry for not
no problem.
for not being able to actually contribute code. Instead, just argue about how we should close an issue. Sorry about that.
No, that happens all the time. Okay, so going back, I think we had Rahul. You're wanting to talk about how we capture the volume size in a backup.
Yeah, sure. So I was looking at the backup describe command, and I couldn't find a way to see the size of the volume which was snapped, right? I believe there is no way at present, and I was thinking how we can incorporate that. So I believe there is no way, right? You can confirm. Can you confirm, Nolan?
Right now, Valero does not capture that data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I thought is maybe in the Velero volume snapshot spec, we can capture the size of the volume, and that we can show as part of native snapshots when doing a describe on the backup. Will that be a correct way to address this? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Typing.
I think what I'd like to do is get, so what's the use case for this so that you know how much space you need to restore into?
We need to capture the size of the data that has been backed up, right?
That's going to be variable.
Yeah, per backup, right? Overall,
no,
you
I
are
mean
backing
per snapshot. I
so,
mean, you don't know how much, like
yeah,
if you take an EBS snapshot, you don't know how much it actually.
correct.
So
And
I think we have both the requirements, Dave. We require what is the actual size of the volume, and when we take the snapshot, what is the amount of real volume, or what is the size of the actual snapshot that which we took.
Yeah, I mean that's like you know the issue, like even like in vSphere, you know, I get this ask, it's like how big is the snapshot, and the snapshots are dependent on each other. So you know you can have a size of a snapshot, you know, you can have like 3 snapshots, right? And one is tiny until you delete 2 because one's dependent on 2, and then one suddenly gets a lot bigger, and so you didn't really save anything because you kept one. But as a user you go, geez, I deleted this snapshot that takes up all this space. Why did I not get all my disk back?
Yeah.
So,
and that's why I'm saying the original volume size is important, because we want to make sure that like if we are doing a backup product, we could something like do where we can say how large the volume is, give them upfront information about what it's going to take, basically, especially if they're doing data movement. That kind of becomes important.
Right, but you know, we're not going to necessarily know, like as we move change block tracking in, we're not going to know how much data we're moving until we actually take the snapshot.
That's true.
I think it's useful on like the restore case to say, hey, you're restoring this and there's a terabyte of data that you're going to restore. Make sure you have at least this much space available to restore into.
There we also need to know the size of the space available on the storage then.
Yeah, that could be one of the use cases.
I would ask that we try to define the use cases and that we look at it across like all the different snapshot technologies that we're on top of, because that's the difficulty, is saying, hey, you know, implement this. And, you know, I honestly can't even give you that answer on vSphere right now. If you ask me how big is a snapshot, the answer is we don't know.
Maybe we start with the volume size itself.
Yeah, so just like the raw volume size, and especially like the restore size, seems like a useful thing. But I mean, you know, it's like what do you want to do? And I hear, you know, it's like, okay, trying to, you know, make sure the user knows how much data is going to be transferred. That may be something where we need to do more like a dry run, for example, where we may even go through and postpone the data movement phase until later. go through snapshot everything, and then you can say, okay, here's how much data has changed in this snapshot from the previous one. Because it may even be an interaction between the snapshot and the backup system, right? Because you do things like dedupe on the fly, and, you know, we may not, you know, we say there's this many blocks changed, but you actually get a different number because you dedupe them, right?
That's correct.
I have two. So I have two questions on this. So we are kind of looking to deprecate the volume snapshot API in favor of the CSI ones. I just asked Xing if there's a place for, on the Kubernetes volume snapshot objects, if there's a place to write this. There is a restore size on the volume snapshot, but it's optional and the CSI driver has to populate it. So Valero could add this, but I think longer term, we would want to advocate for rolling this into the volume snapshot CSI objects. I agree that it's all useful data, and I also agree it's all weird. It's not accurate data. So I wanted to toss this out. And in my view, I get this is important for like uploads and things like that, and on restore, knowing if you have enough room. But I'm also wondering if you've given any thought to how this might work with RESTIC or a file system level reporter. This may be more on Dave and I to work on our data movement layer, but I'm just curious if RESTIC is even in your use case, or you're just using volume snapshots.
So it gets interesting even with RESTIC, because there also you are moving the data off from the current volume onto some other volume. The amount of time it's going to take depends on, I mean, if we're not talking about the variability of the snapshot itself, just persistent volume, knowing what is the size of the persistent volume can tell you a little bit about how much time it's going to take to finish this backup job.
Yet only on the first backup.
Yeah.
So I like the idea. I think it's going to take some thought, and you guys probably have some examples you can bring in from the net backup side of how you do this elsewhere, and we can look at following that. I think we want to make this, you know, optional, because we're either going to have to come up with something that really works everywhere, or we have to make this like an optional thing, because I don't know that we can get this out of every cloud provider even. Like, you know, Azure is it Azure or Google Cloud Snapshots? It's like incrementals, and
Azure supports incrementals via the same API. Yeah.
Yeah, but can we get the info out of it, or we have to tell it we need to take an incremental? Is that the deal? Anyway, so
yeah, I think we can. My perspective is we need to track it in both Valero and the CSI API. So we need to go advocate for, can we put like total volume size in these CSI volume snapshots?
So anyway, I think Rahul was having some ideas around it.
Yeah, correct. So Amber, I had primarily the idea about capturing the volume size, right? As Amber, you also mentioned, these two are different things, right? Volume size and snapshot size. So primarily what we need is a volume size at present, and that we can capture while performing the snapshot, and we can persist it in the volume snapshot spec. If it's a snapshot size, it has to come from the volume snapshotter plugin, which will be it has to come from the provider end, right?
Yes, and
so that would be much. We need to validate with different type of providers, right? And I believe cloud providers should provide the size, because the user gets billed as per the data content within the snapshot. The other point that I think was discussed is incremental or full. I think the cloud provider internally will figure out if it has to be the incremental snapshot or full. They have their own implementation, as per my understanding, right?
But depends, right? Like we said, for Azure, you've got to say incremental.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that is opaque to the consumer, right? How it performs incremental and full. So that's what I was thinking.
No, you have to specify you're doing one.
Is it? Okay.
Oh, Azure, it's a flag you turn on, and then all backups will be incremental.
Okay, for AWS, I did not find any way to perform incremental or full at least.
AWS
yeah,
is
but
automatic.
maybe, yeah. So maybe these two are different things, right? So can we treat it this way? Can we incorporate the volume size first, and then we can check how we can incorporate a snapshot size, and if that is feasible as well, as you raise some of the points, right?
So yes, so what we're going to be doing is formalizing our process for roadmap items and design. This is something that we can have as a roadmap item for maybe 1.7. What we'd like to have is a proposal to put it on the roadmap, and then like a design doc that goes through this. One of the things to keep in mind is the vSphere plugin is not a volume snapshotter, it's a backup item action. And I think that's one of your primary use cases. So we need to make sure that however this works for, and the CSI snapshotter is also not a volume snapshotter, it's a backup item action. So we're working on unifying those. That may happen probably in the 1.8.2.0 type time frame. So, you know, we need to weigh how this goes in, you know, versus the two different types of snapshotter plugins we have available right now.
Yeah. Right. That's for the snapshot size, right? The roadmap item that we discussed. But can we, are we okay to incorporate volume size?
I'm telling you that volume size, there's two different snapshot paths. There's volume snapshotter, which is what you've been looking at. Okay. And that covers EBS, the old EBS actually, because new EBS is getting pushed towards CSI snapshots. There's EBS, Azure, Google Cloud, and the old Valero or vSphere plugin, the 1.0 plugin. The CSI snapshotter and the new vSphere plugin, the 1.1.0 plugin, are both backup item actions. They do not actually create a volume, volume status spec? So they don't, so there's a different path. So what I'd like to do is start from the top, talk about what the needs are here, and then we'll do a design, and then we'll do some code.
So the needs, like I mentioned, we need to capture the amount of data that has been backed up, not in terms of snapshots, but what is getting protected in terms of source, right? The volume. So yeah, that is pretty much required. And so you want me to further explore for these different plugins, right? Typically for the vSphere plugin, that's what you mentioned, it has a different path, right? That needs to be investigated.
So we can get this info, like for example, the PV, I think has the size in it, right?
Yes, it has the total size, not used size, but yeah.
Yeah, so we can use that, for example, as a volume size, but we should just, currently I don't think we store the PV records in the backup.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's even an option for getting it out of that. So what I'd like to do is explore the use cases and explore, you know, a design, but not jump straight to, hey, we added this field.
Okay, sure. You mentioned about we capture PV as part of backup, right? So are we referring to resource list here?
So when Valero restores, it iterates over the Kubernetes YAML, and if there's an annotation, I believe it's an annotation on the PV Kubernetes YAML, then it will go look up the snapshot in that annotation. So basically, to make a snapshot, you need to have some sort of PV. So we could probably extend it to scrape that, but I agree with Dave that we need to look at a more holistic design, especially because we're moving away from the volume snapshotter API and going to let the CSI drivers take that.
Okay. Okay, sure. So I will work on this further and propose something, and something which we can discuss in the next meeting.
Cool.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Awesome. So we're at about 9 minutes left. Frankie and Raphael.
Yes. Yes, our update is pretty short. It's that the multiple API groups feature, or being able to back up multiple API groups and then restore. Yeah, 3133. Yep. Just wanted to update everyone that the PR is very close to being approved, and looks like Raphael has some comments about the documentation, so I'll go ahead and make those updates. But yeah, very, very happy to have made progress with that.
Thank you, Nolan, for the approval. I just review another pass on the documentation is recommending a couple tweaks, making cross-reference a couple pages. We have the cluster migration page. I think it's worthwhile to point that we have this feature coming along, and make a cross-reference of the backup file format as well. We left today, the current page tells that we're gonna address restore in the future. I think we should change that to say now we have the feature flag as part of the restore. And I think that's pretty much it. There is only one thing that we can discuss offline, if you fit. Part of this PR, we have the Rock Band CRD that we use to play around. The YAML files are part of this PR on the end-to-end, but for the actually CRD, we need the webhook active. So right now, those YAML files point to my registry where those controllers are sitting. So I don't know if it's okay, acceptable for the testing, or if you want completely control of those, then move the controller code to Valero repo. And it's a lot of code on it, actually. So I'm fine to either way. It's just for the test, by the way. It's not the actual Valero core, right? No.
Yeah. We may have to see if we can get that moved into VMware Tanzu. I don't know if it would be fit for.
It's a good one. Yeah, maybe it's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if it's fit for Valero itself, since it's like a controller that we're just kind of doing mock tests on. But we can see if we can get that incorporated into VMware Tanzu, so it's closer.
Okay. No, let's take that offline. I like this idea. That's all. That's all. Cool. I have.
And yeah, for maintainers and reviewers, just like to note that this is a release blocker. So if you can take a look at this. In terms of priorities, I think we should get Bridget unblocked first, but in my opinion, I think this is pretty much code complete. In fact, I wouldn't mind personally if we addressed these documentation changes in a follow-up, but please give it a review and share your thoughts.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay. If we don't have anything else, I'll give just a moment. Okay. So we've got some more community shout outs this week. So first we've got Abby, who is helping us clean up the FAQ pages and refer to GitHub discussions instead. This should hopefully alleviate some confusion on where we're putting our actual answers. And I'll also mention, again, we have our Q&A section in the GitHub discussions. So thank you, Abby, for clarifying that. Second, we have Mike 1808. This is someone else at VMware. But we now have some colorized output on Valero backup, restore, and schedule commands. This isn't, it's not super big, but it shows, it'll give you colorized output for like the status of phases and things like that. So if it's failed, it'll be red. If it's successful, it'll be green. Next, we have one from Shall We Dance, Taek Kim. And this fixed a bug that could possibly happen in Restic restores. We assumed that the Restic container would always be the first init container, but that's not necessarily true. It may be, all right, sorry. Yeah, sorry, we're checking the length correctly. Sorry, I was thinking of another PR. But we're no longer restricted to only the first init container for Restic, because sometimes those get moved around on restore. And then finally, we have a feature, it looks like this is on the Helm chart. So this is Service Monitor, which I believe is a, yeah, this is part of the metrics. Not part of core Valero, but this allows for some more flexible configuration in the Helm chart. So thank you very much, Zadkiel, for this change. And with that, got 2 minutes left. So I think I can let everyone go. Have a good rest of your week. Oh, and quick reminder, next Monday is US President's Day, so the team will be out.
And we're also out on Friday for our own internal holiday, so
yep,
we may not respond.
Yep. All right. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Thanks for the
All right, take
conversation.
care.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.